Tom Wright. You co-authored it. Was it Wright or was it Ward? John Crossan. Okay. I knew he was one of the famous guys. Anyway, he's authored books, and he's one of my mentors and a model. So Dick, we're happy to have you back. I'm going to give him the microphone, and he's just going to share with you. And Dick, will you entertain questions maybe at the end, or? Okay, all right. And if you can't hear him, just wiggle your ears or something. I'll be right back.
I'd like to see that ear wiggling. Is that a part of the liturgy these days? Well, it's been a long time. It's been a long time since I've been here. I'm feeling a little bit like, who's the comedian who was about to have his 100th birthday?
George Burns.
Hmm?
George Burns.
George Burns, thank you. And at age 99, he was offered a 5-year contract to perform in Las Vegas, and he said, "Are you people crazy? 5-year contract? How do I know you'll still be in business 5 years from now?" That's kind of the way I feel. Well, for me, it started with reading a book. And the book was called The Arms Bazaar. It was not fun reading. It was, of course, now 50 years ago. It's hard to realize that everything is how are we doing now? I have memories of 50 years ago together. But this book, The Arms Bazaar, didn't have any good news in it. It was about the global trade in armaments. And although very soon there was a lot of attention to nuclear weapons, this book actually was about the arms trade to what in those days we called the third world countries. And what caught my attention was at the time that this book was written, the hottest market for armaments was the Middle East. Eight countries were involved in heavy military spending. 4 of them were clients of the Soviet Union, and 4 of them were clients of the United States. I thought this was crazy. I still think it's crazy. But what were we to do about that was a puzzle to me that I spent a lot of time thinking about. What can we do? I was puzzling about that a couple Sunday afternoons when I met with a group that I called Partners in Preaching. What we did was we'd have a group of only maybe 6 or 7 people from this congregation who would meet with me on a Sunday afternoon, and we would talk about the lectionary reading for the next Sunday. What I would ask them, what should I say about this text? What do you hear the text saying to you? And sometimes it flowed easily and sometimes it was difficult. And it was difficult this Lenten period when the text for the coming week was, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. I always thought that that conversation was a little difficult, mainly because we weren't really in the market for crosses. So what should we have to say about that? When I was puzzling over this one day in my office, I suddenly made a connection between this text and the book about the Arms Bazaar. And I thought, what is it that we can do about a global-sized problem like this? Well, my wife always had a very helpful comment. No, not all of her comments were helpful. But this one was, she always said, if you're going to tell people to get involved with a big problem, you have to tell them something they can do about it. What can we as ordinary persons do about a globe that was awash in armaments, two sides arrayed against one another, and here we are wondering what next? Well, the outcome of that was that I preached a sermon and I managed to dig up a copy, half 100 years ago, called Taking Up the Cross of Christ, the Arms Race, and the Mission of the United Presbyterian Church. And you will see that I took my wife's good advice, because here is part of that sermon. I had already talked about the bad news, but I'm reading now from the sermon, but I do not want to lay a heavy burden on already burdened people. It's understandable that people with their own families, jobs, and burdens should ask, but what can I do? The task of waging peace is laid upon the whole body of the church, not just isolated members of it. And for that reason, I make a proposal to you this morning. I propose that our church, through the presbytery, petition our General Assembly to make a commitment to slowing, stopping, and reversing the arms race. Let that be a mission priority of the Presbyterian Church. Such a commitment might involve raising at least $2 million to initiate the program, to create a ministry of education about alternatives to violence, placing skilled interpreters across the country, and developing a Christian citizens network to deal with issues of arms control and military spending. That afternoon, I got a phone call from kind of a crusty elder who said, I need to talk to you about that sermon. So I made a date for the next Monday morning to talk with him. And when he came and sat down, I noticed that I was holding on to the arm of the chair a little tighter than usual. And he said, I don't talk about things like this in public. I'm a behind-the-scenes sort of a person, but I just want to say to you, if there's anything I can do to help this program you're suggesting, just call on me. Never assume that somebody is either all for you or all against you. Take a deep breath and listen. And I found a lot of people like my crusty elder who were responsive to this call. Well, so what happened next? I mentioned the group that I had called Partners in Preaching, and I had asked the congregation, if anybody's interested in helping with this, come to my office this afternoon and we'll talk. Well, there were half a dozen or more people. Ginny, where's Ginny? Were you part of that group that afternoon? Yes, you were. Thank you. 45 years later.
You think you did what?
Yes. Well, so we were brainstorming, so what can we do about this proposal? First of all, I might say that we were going to get an initial, I'm jumping a little ahead of myself, I'm going to back up. One thing that we had to work with was the sermon. So, being good Presbyterians, we thought, well, we can at least spread the word of the sermon and this proposal. So we went to work with a mimeograph machine. You remember what a mimeograph machine was?
Yeah.
And something called a typewriter. And it was a very primitive era. But we produced a whole lot of copies of this sermon, and we sent them to every name we could find at 475 Riverside Drive in New York City, which was the national office of the Presbyterian Church. And anybody who we could identify, including candidates for the General Assembly that year. And later we discovered that people in New York City at 475 Riverside Drive were talking to one another saying, "What's going on out there in Cleveland?" And we began to get a little bit of attention. Well, what next? All I knew to do was to get a thick volume of statistics from the General Assembly, and in this book it listed every Presbyterian church in the country and every Presbyterian minister in the country. And I just started leafing from page 1 through this and underlining the name and address of anybody I'd ever heard of or had any connection with. Out of this effort, we had more than 30 presbyteries all petition the General Assembly to do what I had proposed in this sermon. And each one of these presbyteries that asked for the General Assembly to make peacemaking a priority mission concern, every one of these went through a process of educating those presbyteries about what we were talking about. So we had hundreds, no, really thousands of Presbyterians who were working together to create in their own language, with their own examples, a petition to the General Assembly to turn the Presbyterian Church into a peace church. We have, we meaning this church, myself, Swords into Plowshares, which I'll talk about in a minute. We have got too much credit, and I'll make a correction in the history, and you may be the first to know it. But so from this sermon and from this church, there was a powerful stream moving against the General Assembly to make this a mission priority. But here's what folks have sometimes missed. There was a second stream acting on the church at the same time, because the General Assembly had for 5 years had a study group which came up with a report almost at the same time that all of these petitions were going to the General Assembly. And they produced a report called Peacemaking, the Believer's Calling. And so this was a second stream of influence pressuring the church to make this peace movement a mission priority. Ultimately, then, the General Assembly acted. Part of our role was Charlene, my wife, and I. We were not delegates to the General Assembly, but at our own expense, we went to the Assembly and just simply continued the only thing we knew to do, which was keep talking. We talked to everybody we could buttonhole, particularly all of the candidates for moderator of the General Assembly. And in the course of doing that, I encountered a group that I hadn't known about called the Witherspoon Society. How many of you have known about the Witherspoons? Yes. And the Witherspoon Society was what I would call the more activist arm of the church. And they were responsive when our paths crossed, and invited me to come out to Colorado, where they had a meeting scheduled. And they said, well, they were on board with this plan, the need for the funds, the General Assembly action. And they said to me at the end of the meeting, would you be supportive if we found somebody to head up this group of presbyteries? I said, of course. They said, well, then will you be the one to do it? And I said, of course. And so that was a powerful impetus to the presbyteries. And when all of these overtures came to the General Assembly, we discovered that it was one of the largest grassroots movements in the Presbyterian Church ever to gather this many overtures, making a presentation for a mission program. Kevin, how are we doing on time? We're going to cut these things short. It reminds me of a time that I was scheduled to speak at a presbytery. I became an instant expert by become involved in this. And I visited presbyteries and all across the country, at least 30 states. Spent a lot of time in airplanes and airports. What did I want to say to you about that? I'd say to you, I actually enjoy old age, except for the fact that I'll start to say something and can't remember what the second half of it was. One of the things that I did want to say before we had to wind this up is I mentioned my crusty elder who turned out to be very supportive. There was another group that turned out to be very supportive of this effort, and it was retired military men. Retired because they weren't free to speak when they were under orders, but who immediately understood what we were talking about, the need to slow, stop, and reverse the arms race before we wreak total devastation on us all. I remember a staff member of the Navy who was working on a nuclear-armed submarine, who said the biggest issue that he had was nobody ever talked about what it was they were in that submarine to do. And it could have destroyed every significant city in the Soviet Union with one Polaris submarine. Another time we brought the retired commandant of the Marine Corps to town and put him on one of our Cleveland radio stations. I remember mostly what he didn't say on the program, but what he did say privately when we asked him, what do we have to do to get politicians who understand the peril we're in? And he said, throw the bastards out. Well, that was one way of saying I'm with you. And this was a happy discovery. The Center for I can't think of the right name. There's a center in Washington where retired military have a think tank, and they were regularly, they're like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, who set the clock a few minutes away from Armageddon. These people can always be supportive of our efforts. One more thing I'd like to say is we quickly discovered that because we did our biblical homework, that shalom biblically doesn't just mean the absence of war. It means the presence of peacemaking. And so the program began to spread out with peacemaking having a more holistic meaning for this program, not just cutting back on armaments, but building a peaceful society. Well, put it this way, there was at the same time a speaker at the Cleveland City Club whose topic was how to make peace with the Russians or your wife. And he was an expert. I think he was one of the authors of a book called Getting to Yes, if I remember correctly. And we began to develop materials also about how do we get along with our teenage children, and what does it mean to make peace in a situation where there is domestic abuse. For myself, it meant getting involved with the only such organization in the state of Illinois that didn't have all lawyers in it. For about 5 years, I was part of working as a volunteer with the court system, with judges who worked with us and gave petitioners before the court an option if they would try mediation with our volunteer group, and they could come to their own answer to the problems that brought them to the court. They would not have to see the judge. And that was a very powerful, one of the greatest experiences of my life, to see that we could often get people around a table in the same room, often for the first time, and it became possible, actually in about 2/3 of all of our cases, to help people learn how to make peace between them. So what began with talking about armaments ended up talking about holistic peacemaking. Time's up. I'll tell you one quick story. I was scheduled to make a speech at a Presbyterian meeting. I would have 20 or 30 minutes, and my time came up to give the speech at 2 minutes to 12, 12 being the magic hour for lunch. I understood when I was licked, so I stood up and said, some things in the Presbyterian Church are sacred and cannot be tampered with, one of which is lunch hour. Thank you all very much.